He thought it would be just another ordinary day on the farm. But behind the old barn door waited something no one could ever imagine. What was hidden beneath the dust and years? Watch till the end to find out. Comment where you're watching from. Leave a like and subscribe. More gripping stories are coming soon. Jacob Turner had lived his entire life on the same stretch of land in rural Ohio, a place where the wind always carried the smell of corn and dust. The farm had once been alive with laughter, music, and the soft voice of his wife, Emily. Now it was quiet, too quiet. Since she passed away 5 years ago, the silence had become its own kind of companion. He woke each morning at sunrise, made his coffee, and watched the light crawl across the kitchen floorboards that still creaked in the same places. The house was filled with reminders of her favorite ceramic mug on the shelf, the folded quilt she'd made during their first winter together, the photographs of harvest days when their smiles seemed endless. But those days felt like a different lifetime, one buried under layers of dust and grief. The Turner farm stretched for miles, its fields once full of corn and soy. But now Jacob only tended a small section, just enough to keep busy, just enough to feel useful. Most of the outbuildings stood unused, their wood weathered gray, and their roofs bowed with time. At the farthest edge of his property stood the old red barn built by his grandfather nearly 80 years ago. It had survived storms, winters, and countless harvests. But Jacob hadn't set foot inside it in years. Something about that barn reminded him too much of what he'd lost. Emily used to love it there, often storing her garden tools or drying herbs along its rafters. After she died, the barn became just another ghost, something easier to ignore than to face. That fall morning, however, something stirred in Jacob's chest. The air was sharp with the smell of cold earth, and a restless wind whispered through the cornstalks. He sipped his coffee on the porch, eyes drifting toward the distant outline of the barn, half swallowed by the fog. The boards on the doors were barely visible. The old paint faded to a dull, bleeding red. He didn't know why, but he felt he needed to go there. Maybe it was the changing season. Maybe the loneliness pressing too hard on his chest. Or maybe it was Emily nudging him from somewhere he couldn't see. After breakfast, Jacob put on his worn coat and gloves and made his way down the dirt path. Each step crunched beneath the leaves scattered like ashes across the ground. The wind grew colder as he neared the barn, and he noticed how overgrown the path had become, grass pushing through cracks, branches reaching across like bony hands. The building looked smaller now, its roof sagging slightly, the once proud doors chained shut with rusted locks. He stopped a few feet away, feeling the weight of memory pressing down. He remembered bringing Emily there one summer evening long ago, the golden light spilling across her hair as she laughed, promising they'd grow old together. That promise had been kept only halfway. Inside his chest, something ached, a slow, familiar pull. He walked the perimeter of the barn, tracing his fingers along the wood, feeling its roughness beneath his gloves. Spiderwebs hung like thin curtains in the corners, and small animal tracks marked the mud. It had been years, but the air around it still carried that faint sweetness of hay and oil, the smell of work and life. He caught himself whispering to the wind, "You'd hate to see it like this, Em." The breeze rustled through the trees as if answering him. For a long moment, Jacob just stood there, staring at the locked doors. He thought about turning back, about letting the past stay buried, but something wouldn't let him. He noticed that the locks were new, shiny metal catching the weak sunlight. That struck him as odd. He hadn't placed them there. His heart tightened slightly, a strange unease crawling beneath his ribs. He told himself it was probably nothing. Maybe the previous tenant or a passing hunter had done it. But deep down the detail lodged like a splinter in his thoughts. He walked around to the side window, brushing away the cobwebs, and peered inside. The light was dim, and dust floated like snow in the air. It looked empty, just shadows, rafters, and broken beams. Yet, the stillness didn't feel natural. It was too deliberate, too controlled, as if the barn were holding its breath. Jacob backed away slowly, feeling an unfamiliar chill trace his spine. He hadn't expected to feel afraid on his own land, but something about the silence there made him uneasy. Still, he pushed the feeling down. He'd come this far, and he wasn't about to turn away from his own property. As he walked back toward the house, the wind shifted, carrying with it the smell of rain. He looked once more at the barn, the locks gleaming faintly against the dark wood. He didn't know why, but the image stayed with him long after he'd closed the door of his home behind him. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, the moonlight spilling over his weathered hands. Memories of Emily filled his mind, her voice, her laughter, her touch. And behind those memories lingered the sight of the locked barn, standing alone in the mist. It was as though the land itself was whispering to him, calling him to uncover something left unseen for too long. By dawn, Jacob had made up his mind. The next morning, he would take his crowbar, head back down the old path, and open those doors. Whatever waited inside that barn, dust, memories, or something else, he knew he needed to face it. He didn't yet understand why, but somewhere deep in his chest, beneath the weight of years and grief, there was a faint flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not regret, but the quiet pull of truth waiting to be found. The next morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the world seem older than it was. Jacob Turner woke before sunrise, as he always did. But there was something different about the air in the house. It felt heavier, quieter. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee untouched, staring at the small frost patterns forming on the window pane. Outside, the fog was thick, curling around the edges of the barn that stood like a forgotten monument at the edge of his property. He had made up his mind. Today he would open it. He slipped on his coat, grabbed his crowbar, and stepped into the morning chill. The ground was stiff with frost, and each step crunched in the stillness. As he approached the barn, his breath came out in pale clouds, and his heart beat harder than he wanted to admit. The locks glinted against the dull wood, 2 of them, thick and new, the kind no farmer would bother to buy. He stopped just a few feet away, staring at them. The metal was polished and unweathered, catching the faint light of dawn like eyes watching him. For a moment, he wondered again if someone else had been here. The idea unsettled him, but curiosity had already taken hold. He wedged the crowbar beneath the first lock and forced it open. The metal groaned in protest, then snapped free with a sharp clang that echoed through the frosty air. The second lock was tougher, and it took nearly 5 minutes before it finally gave way. He pulled the chains aside and let them fall to the ground with a heavy rattle. As he pushed the barn doors open, a breath of cold, stale air rushed out, carrying the smell of dust, oil, and something faintly chemical. Jacob hesitated at the threshold. The dim light from outside filtered in through the high windows, cutting through the dust that hung thick in the air. Inside, the barn seemed almost empty. The wooden beams loomed above him like the ribs of an ancient beast. The floor was bare except for a few scattered boards and a single hay bale sitting precisely in the center of the open space. It looked too neat, too deliberate, as if someone had placed it there for a reason. The sight made Jacob's stomach tighten. He took a few cautious steps forward, boots creaking against the floorboards. The hay bale was fresh, not old or brittle, but recently moved. The rest of the barn, however, told a different story. Cobwebs in the rafters, dust on the shelves, forgotten tools leaning against the walls. Nothing else had been touched. He circled the hay bale, studying it. It wasn't large, just enough to cover something about the size of a trapdoor. The idea came to him slowly, a whisper in the back of his mind. He crouched beside it, his knees popping, and pressed his gloved hands against the coarse straw. It shifted under his touch, lighter than he expected. With one push, he rolled it aside, revealing a wooden panel beneath it, half buried in dirt. His breath caught. It was square with a small metal handle attached to one side, clearly man-made, not part of the barn's original design. For a long moment, Jacob just stared. The air seemed to grow colder, the silence deeper. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears. This wasn't something any farmer would build. A storage cellar maybe, but hidden under hay, sealed in dirt with new locks on the doors. No, something wasn't right. He reached out and brushed the dirt away, his fingers trembling slightly. The metal handle was smooth and faintly warm, as if it had been touched recently. That thought made him draw back, scanning the barn as if expecting to see someone else there. But there was nothing, only shadows and the echo of his own breathing. He stood there for several minutes trying to reason through what he was seeing. Maybe someone had been using the barn without his knowledge. Maybe teenagers had found it and were hiding something stupid, like fireworks or alcohol. Or maybe a darker part of him thought it was something far worse. The uneasy feeling that had begun the day before returned, heavier now, sitting like a weight on his chest. But turning back wasn't an option. This was his land, his barn, and he had a right to know what lay beneath it. He tightened his grip on the crowbar and slipped its edge under the wooden panel. It resisted at first, creaking softly, then began to lift with a low groan that sent a shiver down his spine. The smell that rose from below was damp and earthy, like soil that hadn't seen the sun in years. Beneath the panel was a staircase, narrow and dark, leading down into a shadow that swallowed the weak light from above. The air was cooler there, heavier, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something else he couldn't identify. Jacob's phone light flicked on with a dim glow. He leaned forward, shining it down the steps. The wooden stairs looked sturdy but old, disappearing into the gloom below. He hesitated, torn between fear and determination. Every instinct told him to close the panel and walk away, to forget he had ever seen it. But another voice, quiet and steady, told him that if he left now, the questions would haunt him forever. He thought of Emily, of the way she always told him the truth had to be faced, no matter how painful. He took a deep breath, wiped his hands on his coat, and started down the stairs. Each step creaked softly beneath his weight. The temperature dropped as he descended, and the air grew thick enough to taste. His flashlight beam danced across rough concrete walls and thick wooden supports. The deeper he went, the more his unease grew. It wasn't just an old storage cellar. Someone had built this recently. The wood was clean, the steps solid. Somewhere below, he thought he heard a faint humming sound like machinery. When his boots touched the dirt floor at the bottom, he stopped. The room was small and square, carved directly into the earth. The light from his phone barely reached the corners, but he could make out the shapes of crates stacked neatly against the walls. A metallic smell filled the air, sharp and sterile. He crouched beside one of the boxes and brushed away the layer of dust. The lid was nailed shut. His hands shook slightly as he pressed against it, feeling the cold hardness beneath. Jacob turned in a slow circle, the light from his phone catching glints of plastic, metal, and sealed containers scattered throughout the room. His pulse quickened. The realization crept over him in fragments. Chemical fumes, sealed packages, electrical wiring snaking along the wall. This wasn't storage. This was something else entirely. He backed away, his breath uneven, his mind trying to grasp what he was seeing. Then, from somewhere above, a faint sound, a floorboard creaking in the barn. Jacob froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned off the flashlight instinctively, plunging himself into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was his own breathing, then silence. Slowly, he climbed back up the stairs, every sense alert. When he emerged into the barn again, everything was still. The doors remained open, the morning light dull and gray. Yet the feeling that he was being watched lingered in the air. He replaced the panel, dragged the hay bale back over it, and stepped outside. The cold hit him hard. His hands were trembling, though he wasn't sure if it was from fear or the chill. He locked the barn again with the broken chains hanging loose, turned toward the house, and walked quickly back up the path. Behind him, the barn stood silent and unchanged, hiding whatever secrets lay beneath it. Inside his chest, his heart hadn't stopped racing. He didn't yet understand what he had found. But one thing was certain. He couldn't face it alone. Tomorrow, he would call the sheriff. Jacob Turner barely slept that night. The images from the dark cellar beneath the barn would not leave his mind. The crates, the plastic, the smell of chemicals that clung to his clothes, even after he washed his hands. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the glow of his phone light slicing through the dust, illuminating things that should not have been there. By dawn, he was sitting at the kitchen table again, staring at the phone. He had told himself he would call the sheriff, but when morning came, he hesitated. What if no one believed him? What if they thought he was somehow involved? But the thought of what lay beneath his barn gnawed at him like a sickness. He could feel the truth pressing against him, waiting to be spoken. When the sun finally crept over the horizon, Jacob pulled on his coat and boots once more. He needed to see it again to make sure he hadn't imagined it. The walk to the barn felt longer than before, the frost crunching underfoot, his breath coming in slow, deliberate clouds. As he reached the building, he noticed the faint marks on the dirt near the doors, tire tracks, maybe, or something dragged across the ground. His pulse quickened. Someone else had been here, perhaps recently. The thought made his hands tremble as he pushed open the doors he had left unchained the day before. Inside, the light from outside reached only so far. The hay bale still sat neatly over the trapdoor, exactly as he had left it, but the sense of stillness was gone. The air felt charged, heavy, as though the barn itself was aware of him. Jacob's eyes darted across the space, every creak and whisper making him flinch. Gathering his courage, he stepped forward, pushed the hay aside again, and lifted the panel. The smell of damp air rose to meet him, stronger than before. He turned on his flashlight and started down the narrow stairs, each step creaking under his weight. The deeper he descended, the colder the air became. The small chamber at the bottom looked exactly as it had the day before. But now that he had time to really look, he noticed more details. The crates weren't just stacked randomly. They were lined up with military precision, each labeled with small symbols and letters he didn't recognize. The floor was packed dirt, but smooth, as if many people had walked there recently. Along one wall ran a series of cables connected to small generators and metal containers. The faint hum he'd heard before was louder now, steady and mechanical. Jacob crouched beside one of the crates and pried at a loose corner. The wood splintered slightly, revealing plastic-wrapped bricks inside, dozens of them, all identical. He didn't have to open one to understand what they were. His heart pounded. Drugs. The realization hit him like ice water. His barn, his land. Someone had been using it for something criminal, something dangerous. The smell of chemicals, the hidden locks, the fresh hay. All of it made sense now. This wasn't just trespassing. This was an operation. And he had stumbled right into the middle of it. He stood there for a long moment, gripping his knees to steady himself. His mind raced through possibilities. How long it had been going on, who had done it, why they had chosen his property. Maybe because it was isolated. Maybe because no one would ever come this far out. He thought of Emily again, her gentle insistence that honesty mattered more than comfort, that fear was only as strong as the silence around it. He swallowed hard, lifted his phone, and dialed the number for the sheriff's office. When the dispatcher answered, Jacob's voice shook as he tried to explain what he'd found. "This is Jacob Turner," he said, his throat dry. "You need to send someone out to my property. There's something under my barn. Something illegal." He expected disbelief, but the dispatcher's tone was calm and professional. Within minutes, she assured him that deputies were on their way. Jacob climbed the stairs and stepped back into the barn, closing the trapdoor behind him. The air outside felt fresher, but it didn't ease the tension in his chest. He walked to the front of the property to wait, his hands buried in his pockets, the cold wind biting at his face. It wasn't long before he saw the faint flash of blue lights through the trees. Relief washed over him when the sheriff's truck rolled up the dirt path, followed by 2 patrol cars. Sheriff Reynolds, a tall man with a lined face and a quiet authority, stepped out and shook Jacob's hand firmly. "Morning, Mr. Turner," the sheriff said. "You said you found something under your barn." Jacob nodded, unable to find the right words. "You'll want to see it yourself," he said finally. Together they walked to the barn, the deputies following behind. Inside, Jacob lifted the panel and motioned to the darkness below. The sheriff turned on his flashlight and descended carefully, his boots echoing on the steps. A few moments later, his voice came from below, low and grim. "You did the right thing calling us," he said. "Nobody's supposed to have this down here." The next few hours passed in a blur. More officers arrived along with vans and investigators carrying cameras and equipment. They documented everything: the crates, the chemicals, the makeshift wiring. One of them told Jacob that it was a large-scale drug lab hidden in plain sight. Must have been operating for months, maybe longer. The realization left Jacob numb. He watched as strangers in gloves and masks moved through his barn, speaking in clipped, efficient tones. His land, his family's legacy, had been turned into something rotten without him ever knowing. When the sheriff returned to speak with him, his expression was serious but kind. "Mr. Turner, you're not in any trouble," he said. "From what we can tell, these people used your property without your knowledge. You're a victim here." Jacob nodded, but the words didn't bring comfort. All he could think about was the years he had avoided the barn, the years he had let it sit untouched. If he'd gone there sooner, maybe he would have found this before it got so bad. As the sun began to set, the flashing lights cast long blue shadows across the fields. The last of the evidence was loaded into trucks, and the officers began to leave. Sheriff Reynolds stayed behind for a moment, standing beside Jacob as they both looked at the barn. "We'll find whoever did this," the sheriff said quietly. "You can count on that." Jacob just nodded again, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the barn against the darkening sky. When everyone was gone, he stood there alone for a long while, the cold settling deep into his bones. The barn was silent once more, but it would never be the same. The truth had been uncovered, but it had come at a price. As he turned to walk back to his house, Jacob felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. The secret beneath his land was no longer hidden. Whatever came next, he knew this chapter of his life had changed everything. The days that followed were a blur of flashing lights, distant voices, and the steady rhythm of questions Jacob Turner never imagined answering. The morning after the discovery, the sheriff's department returned in full force, this time with investigators from the state and men in plain clothes who spoke quietly but moved with sharp precision. Jacob stood on the porch as a convoy of police vehicles pulled up his long dirt road, the air filled with the hum of engines and the crunch of tires over gravel. He had not slept. The weight of what had been found beneath his barn pressed down on him like the frost covering his fields. He knew his land would never feel the same again. Sheriff Reynolds met him at the gate, his face serious but not unkind. "Mr. Turner," he said, "we'll need your full cooperation for the investigation. I know this isn't easy." Jacob nodded without hesitation. He led them back to the barn, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The morning fog hung low, curling around the edges of the building like smoke. Inside, the air still carried that faint chemical smell, though most of the crates had already been removed. The investigators were photographing the walls, collecting soil samples, and marking the floor with chalk. Jacob stood near the entrance, watching as they moved methodically through the space that had once held his memories of harvests and laughter. Now it was just a crime scene. The sheriff explained that the people responsible had likely accessed the barn through the back road that connected his property to the old railway trail, a route Jacob hadn't used in years. The gang had probably chosen his land because of its isolation, far enough from town that no one would hear or see a thing. They had built the underground chamber months ago, hidden by the clutter and neglect of an aging barn. For them, it was perfect. For Jacob, it was betrayal in its cruelest form. At the sheriff's request, Jacob sat on the tailgate of a patrol truck while a young deputy took his statement. He recounted everything. How he had noticed the new locks, how he found the trapdoor, how he had descended into the cellar with only his phone for light. The deputy's pen scratched steadily against the paper. "You didn't notice any vehicles or strangers around the property in recent months?" she asked. Jacob shook his head. "No, I don't get many visitors," he said quietly. "I guess that's why they picked my place." She looked at him sympathetically before closing her notebook. "You did the right thing coming forward," she said. By midday, the news had spread. Reporters arrived, their vans parked along the main road beyond the fence line. Cameras aimed toward the barn. Jacob kept his distance. He didn't want to see his name in headlines or his home turned into a spectacle. Sheriff Reynolds promised to keep the press off his property and handled most of the questions himself. From the kitchen window, Jacob watched the lights of the news crews flicker through the fog like distant fireflies. The world beyond his quiet farm was suddenly too close, too loud. Over the following week, officers came and went, cataloging evidence and running forensics. They found traces of chemicals used in the production of narcotics, fingerprints on containers, and tools left behind in haste. It was clear the operation had been abandoned quickly, likely after someone realized the barn had been opened. A week later, word came that 3 suspects had been arrested in the next county, men tied to a larger criminal network. Sheriff Reynolds stopped by to tell Jacob personally. "They'll be facing serious charges," he said. "Turns out they'd been using properties like yours all over the state. You were just unlucky enough to be one of them." Jacob nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He felt a hollow sort of relief. Justice, maybe, but not peace. Despite being cleared of any involvement, Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the land itself had turned against him. The barn that once symbolized family and hard work now stood as a monument to deceit. At night, when the wind moved through the trees, he thought he could still hear the faint hum of machinery from beneath the ground, though he knew it was only memory. The soil that had nurtured his crops had also hidden something poisonous. One afternoon, he returned to the barn alone after the officers had finished their work. The trapdoor had been sealed shut, the floor reinforced with concrete. The place looked cleaner now, almost sterile, but it still felt wrong. He walked slowly across the empty space, his footsteps echoing off the walls. In the corner, he noticed a single nail left behind, glinting faintly in the sunlight that streamed through a cracked window. He bent down, picked it up, and held it between his fingers. Such a small thing, yet it represented how fragile safety truly was. Sheriff Reynolds visited again before leaving town. He found Jacob sitting on the porch staring at the fields. "You holding up?" he asked. Jacob nodded. "I'll be fine," he said softly. "Just feels strange knowing what was happening so close." The sheriff sighed. "These things have a way of sticking with a person. But you did what most wouldn't. You faced it." He handed Jacob a card with his number on it, then stood. "If you ever need anything, you call me." Jacob thanked him quietly as the sheriff walked back to his car. As evening fell, the sky burned with streaks of orange and purple, the kind of beauty that made the world seem merciful again. Jacob sat for a long while, listening to the crickets rise with the night. The flashing lights and heavy boots were gone. Only the whisper of the wind through the cornstalks remained. He knew things could never return to how they were, but there was comfort in knowing the truth was out, that whatever darkness had crept onto his land had been driven away. In the distance, the barn stood silent, its red walls fading into shadow. It would take time before he could bring himself to go inside again. But as the stars appeared one by one, Jacob felt the first fragile stirrings of calm. The lies buried beneath his land were gone, and what remained, though scarred, was his to reclaim. The night was cold, but the weight in his chest had lightened. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that healing, slow, uncertain, but real, might still be possible. Winter crept slowly over the Ohio fields, covering the earth with a thin veil of frost that shimmered in the pale light of morning. The days had grown shorter, the nights longer and quieter. And for Jacob Turner, the world seemed to have finally exhaled after months of tension. The barn stood sealed and silent now, its great doors chained by the county, its floor poured over with fresh concrete to cover what once lay beneath. The police had finished their work. The reporters had stopped calling, and the land had returned to its stillness. Yet, even with the quiet restored, something deep within Jacob had changed. The farm was his again, but it no longer felt the same. It was as though the ground itself had learned to keep secrets, and he could never quite forget that. Each morning, he walked the familiar paths across his fields, boots pressing into frozen soil, breath clouding before his face. He checked the fences, the old machinery, the empty chicken coop that hadn't seen life in years. Routine was his way of finding peace, the rhythm that held his thoughts steady. Sometimes when he passed the barn, he would stop for a moment, hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight strike its red walls. It no longer frightened him, but it didn't comfort him either. It was a monument now, a reminder that darkness could hide anywhere, even beneath something as ordinary as hay and wood. The sheriff had stopped by one last time before Christmas. Sheriff Reynolds brought paperwork, clearing Jacob officially of any connection to the drug operation, and a handshake that carried more meaning than words. "You can rest easy now," the sheriff said. "You did the right thing." Not many would have had the courage to go down there. Jacob had only nodded, thanking him quietly. But courage didn't feel like the right word. It hadn't been bravery that made him open that trapdoor. It had been something simpler and heavier. Responsibility, maybe, or the inability to turn away from what his heart already knew was wrong. Evenings were the hardest. The wind would press against the windows, the wood stove crackling softly in the corner, and Jacob would find himself thinking about Emily. Her laughter still lived in the echoes of the house, her presence in the quilt draped over the chair, her handwriting in the recipes tucked into the kitchen drawer. Sometimes he spoke to her out loud, just as he used to. He told her about the sheriff, about the arrests, about the silence that followed. And though there was no answer, he felt somehow that she heard him. He imagined her sitting beside him at the table, the faint smell of her lavender soap lingering in the air, her voice as gentle as the winter light. One evening near the end of December, snow began to fall. It came softly at first, then heavier, blanketing the world in white. Jacob stood at the window, watching it gather on the porch rails and the branches of the oak tree by the fence. The world outside looked pure again, untouched and quiet. He felt something stir inside him, a slow, unfamiliar warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning behind him. It was peace, fragile and real. For the first time in years, he let himself feel it fully. The next morning, he bundled up and walked out across the field. The snow crunched beneath his boots, each step deliberate and slow. When he reached the barn, he paused. The roof was covered in white, the door dusted with frost. He stood there for a long moment, breath rising in soft clouds, before placing his gloved hand on the wood. It was cold, rough, solid. "It's over now," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the still air. He didn't expect a response, yet something in the quiet seemed to answer, a kind of acceptance that lived between the earth and sky. Jacob turned back toward the house, the morning sun glinting off the snow. The fields stretched endlessly before him, golden lights spilling across them like a promise. He realized then that the land, for all it had seen, was still his sanctuary. It had held tragedy and fear, but it had also given him truth. And truth, however painful, was its own kind of grace. As he reached the porch, he stopped to look one last time at the barn. It stood strong and steady against the horizon, no longer a place of secrets, but a marker of everything he had endured. He smiled faintly, feeling the cold air sting his cheeks. Life would go on, quietly and without fanfare, the way it always had on this land. And somewhere in the hush of the morning, he imagined Emily's voice, soft and clear as a prayer carried by the wind. Jacob opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind him. The sun climbed higher. The snow sparkled brighter. And the farm, his farm, breathed once again in peace. Sometimes the past hides secrets best left undisturbed. But the truth always finds its way out. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe, hit like, and tell us where you're watching from. More stories are coming soon. Don't miss them.